was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. Oh, it worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie, please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom, boom. I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. Welcome to Peace with Penny. I'm Penny S.T., and I'm your host today. I'll be interviewing Nechama Goldman Barash, a Jewish Israeli peace activist, and she works with Roots Shorshim Judah, one of my favorite peace organizations in the West Bank, who works on peace between Israelis and Palestinians. She's a grassroots peacemaker living in Gush Etzion, which makes her an Israeli settler. We'll get into how she feels about that label later. Life in the West Bank is intense, and the communities who live there and throughout Israel experience the Israeli-Palestinian conflict daily. There's no escape. It's their home. The recent 40 Palestinian missiles and the rioting between Palestinians and right-wing Israelis are just two examples. I've enjoyed learning about Nechama, and to me, her commitment to working on peace was built piece by piece throughout her religious Jewish life. As a young child, she observed her parents' dedication to our tribe, and after multiple trips to Israel throughout her youth, she made Aliyah, the Jewish expression for returning to Israel, the homeland of the Jewish people. As she learned increasingly more about the realities on the ground, like for so many Israeli-Palestinian conflict peacemakers, there are at least two very different narratives that exist simultaneously, and both must be respected and acknowledged. Oy, it's not easy. Even so, in re-listening to our Peace with Penny interviews, they always seem to soothe my soul. If there are many people working toward peace from both sides, like a marathon, if they keep putting one foot in front of the other, won't they ultimately reach the finish line of people living together in peace? I surely hope so. What we learn, again, I say it's not easy. So often, something I've heard from the other's narrative disturbs me down to my kishkas, my insides. But now I must face it. I'm an adult. Open my ears and my heart and truly listen. What they say can be an ugly reality that I don't want to concede, but must. I have to ask myself, does what they're saying ring true? Many of the Palestinians Nechama works with happen to be Christians, certainly a minority amongst their own people, but their voice must be heard as well. How do they feel? We'll ask Nechama what they've told her. Nechama made Aliyah from Philadelphia over 20 years ago after graduating from Stern College. She has a master's degree in Talmud from Bar-Ilan University. She teaches Talmud and contemporary Halacha at Matan Pardes and at Torah V'Avodah. Interestingly, she is also a certified sex educator, and she is an active member of Beit Hillel, an Israeli Modern Orthodox Rabbinical Association. Nechama has been deeply affected by her ongoing participation in Roots Jewish Christian Leaders Interfaith Dialogue Group, where she has forged important bonds with Palestinian faith leaders. Nechama is currently working on a book dealing with matters of gender and halakha. Welcome, Nechama.
Hi, Penny. Thank you for having me on your show.
I'm excited to have you. Israel's environment is always changing. Did the recent Palestinian rockets and rioting impact your life directly? And if so, how?
So thankfully, no. I mean, the rioting that's going on is taking place outside of the old city, and I work in a different part of Jerusalem. And the rockets are falling more along the coast and in the south. Of course, I live outside of Jerusalem, not in that area at all. But it affects you in the sense that whenever there's an escalation of violence between Israelis and Palestinians, there's always the fear of where is it going to go, and is it going to be contained, and is this a blip, or is this going to turn into something farther reaching? And so it's very much there. I also have students who are volunteering with Magen David Adom, and they've been called to Damascus Gate to treat some of the rioters, which I'm very proud of them for doing with compassion, with the ability to bring what they're supposed to bring to that space and to the scenes where people are getting hurt, and so I'm hearing about it through them.
So these are Israeli students?
They're actually not. They're my American students, gap year students who are here for the year. And in this time of year, a number of them have trained to work on the ambulances. Again, they're like on the lowest level of what is allowed. They took, I forget how many hours of courses and tests and were certified to ride on the ambulance. And this is part of what they're doing, their volunteer duty to give back to the country.
And I wanted to bring into this because I know that you just got back from an iftar at Roots. Can you explain what that is and what you were doing there? And we go from, the concern that, this might escalate in rockets and rioting to actual peace work, which is my favorite thing to talk about. So what were you up to tonight?
So one of the reasons I went tonight is I felt very strongly that I wanted to make sure, the building bridges and the human connections that are so reflective of the work we do at Roots. The iftar is a break fast for, throughout the month of Ramadan. Muslims are fasting from sunrise to sunset, and the iftar is the break fast. And so Roots, which is where Israelis and Palestinians meet, it's a lovely little complex at the Gush Etzion Junction, kind of set right behind it, next to a little farm that's there. It's land that belongs to the Abu Awad family, and they designated it for this kind of coming together and interaction. And so, so they have several iftars, not every night, right? But they have several iftars in the month of Ramadan, to bring together Jewish activists and their friends and family to come and celebrate the break fast with Muslims. And the food is kosher, which is unusual, right? I have several students who said to me, "Oh yeah, I went to an interfaith iftar in America, but the food wasn't kosher, right? We couldn't actually eat." And as an observant Jew, and many of the activists are observant Jews and settlers, right? So they're that interesting space where kind of the perceived right-wing settler who's Orthodox is coming together to break bread with the fundamentalist Muslim, right? And here we are coming together, and no one is particularly fundamentalist, and everyone is in a good mood and having a good time and eating together, which is so important. So that was what was happening tonight.
That's fantastic. I love hearing those stories because, frankly, we don't hear of them. I mean, I do because I'm into this very much so, but people you know, that's not what the newspapers write about, unfortunately.
Mhm.
But that's a wonderful story. And I think what we'll do now is, I really loved your background. And to me, you really, you know, grew up inch by inch, becoming a Jewish Orthodox peace activist, essentially. And so I'd like to go back to you grew up in Philadelphia. And what was your religious affiliation at that, as you were growing up?
So Penny, I realized I hadn't, you know, there's a piece of the story I actually realized I left out as I'm hearing
Oh.
your biography. When I grew up, we moved to Philadelphia when I was 12. And
Oh.
I think what happened before that is actually, you know, if I think, go back a little further and think about how I became sensitive to other narratives. My dad taught at Penn State. He's a professor of philosophy of science. And we lived in a little town called Lewistown, about 45 minutes from State College. And I was the only Jewish kid in my school. And that sense of being different, right, of having a Shabbat. My parents are Orthodox. I affiliate as Orthodox. I'm strictly observant, as an observant Jew. And that idea that my mom would take me out of school, like, you know, Christmas, before Christmas, or before, you know, like on the Christian holidays, so that it was clear that I was not, you know, celebrating with them. My friends were non-Jews. And we only left Lewistown when I was 8. So on one hand, there was a comfort level with non-Jews. On the other hand, there was always a sense of difference. And then when we moved to Allentown, because that was our next stop, I was the only religious or observant class. And that too had me being different, right? Being other, being, you know, everyone's having parties on Shabbat and eating food that isn't kosher. I had to bring my kosher food with me on the Sunday parties, right? And so I think that, you know, definitely sensitized me to what it means to be different. And then you're more sensitive to other people who are different. We moved to Philadelphia when I was 12, and that's when I was fully immersed in an Orthodox school with Orthodox friends. And that's where, you know, there's this kind of comfort level of finally feeling like I fit in. And of course, part of my background was this religious Zionist home, right? So religious Zionism was very dominant in my house, but in my school, right? So in my school, we were split between the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox, right? I was in a class where there were many kids who were not Zionists, and there was always the fight over, you know, not the right, everyone agreed Israel should exist, but what the nature of the state should be and what it should look like and so on.
Your mom even insisted that you learn Hebrew. So can you tell us? I know as a kid, I mean, today you're grateful, as a kid, not so much. So what was that like?
No. I can actually zero in. I can close my eyes and remember the summer times where my mom would force me to sit next to her, and we would read these lovely little Hebrew stories she had. I can even picture the little books she had, and, you know, the dragging of the feet and the slumping over, and like, my mom did not care. Like, you were sitting there for an hour every morning and reading, and she made me look up words. And that started when I was in like first, second grade, and continued on. And she was an American who just really loved Hebrew, and she taught herself. And then as she became more proficient, she started taking classes and became quite an outstanding Hebrew teacher. But that sense that if she didn't start teaching us when we were young, we were not going to be fluent in the language, was very prescient, meaning she was correct. And it certainly served me well in the trips I made to Israel before I made Aliyah, and then when I made Aliyah.
Yeah, your home was very Zionist, and even your dad, you told me when the 6-Day War happened that he volunteered to help. Can you tell us a little bit of that story. And
Yeah, that was one of the stories I really grew up in. I recently taped him because I want to save it for my grandchildren. Please God, he'll live and be well, but I'd like to be able to tell them the story. He came on the last flight out of America before the war broke out, and he went to volunteer on a kibbutz, a religious kibbutz, religious Zionist kibbutz in Israel called Chafetz Chaim, because all the men had gone to war, and only the women and children and old men were left. And so they needed help with the irrigation and the cotton fields and the hay, I think he said. And he remembers the planes were taking off to go fight in the airfield right next to the kibbutz. So like you basically ducked every time a plane went off. And he was such a good worker. They actually offered him a position to come live membership on the kibbutz, which, you know, kibbutzim are really tough places. Like, you know, they don't brook any slackers, any weakness. Like, it definitely was a testimony to what a hard worker he was, because they were not offering that to slackers. And then he told us how he went to the Western Wall a few days after the war was over, you know, with the thousands and thousands of pilgrims kind of coming from all over the country. That stunned awareness that something enormous had taken place, and that he was part of it. And he really did hope to make Aliyah, and for a lot of reasons. He went back, he got his doctorate, he married my mom. They tried a few times, nothing quite fit in terms of what jobs he was being offered and the kind where they wanted to live. And I felt that, you know, when I moved to Israel at 21, I was fulfilling his dream, but it had become my own, right? That being part of that moment in history.
wow. Growing up, you did make several trips to Israel. Can you talk about that and how you had told me in the pre-interview how there were different events that kind of were beginning to form your own viewpoint of the situation.
Yeah, so we came when I was 11, when I was in 6th grade. I joined the religious Zionist youth group called B'nai Akiva. It was a very interesting year. It was on one hand exhilarating, this awareness of belonging in this country. I felt it very acutely. I remember feeling it and feeling like this was my home and I was going to move here. And there was also a loneliness because I was an American. And that's something I've struggled with. I live here for 30 years. And that sense of dual identity of, on one hand, Jewish and feeling at home in a Jewish country and Israeli, and then that sense of alienation because I'm an American, right? I don't quite fit. I remember feeling that when I was 11. I came back when I was 18. I did a gap year. It's very common for particularly Orthodox kids, although today non-Orthodox kids from other denominations, Nifty and Nativ, and you know, all the denominations have programs here. But I came on an Orthodox program, a women's study, what's called a seminary, and I spent the year studying Jewish text. And one of the things that I shared with you, Penny, that I'd like to talk about is, you know, I said to you when we started talking, how do you change your narrative? Because until I was 18, my narrative was so passionately religious Zionist, right? The land is ours. We deserve to walk and own and kind of, I'm going to use conquer, right? Every square inch of the land. Very inspired by the biblical texts and Joshua and everything going on in Jewish texts. And I felt that very, very passionately. And towards the end of my year, it was around this time of year, May, there's something called Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, which is a day in which the victory of the 6-Day War is commemorated. It actually is unlike Independence Day, which is celebrated by everyone in the country except maybe the most ultra-Orthodox, and obviously the Israeli Arabs and the Palestinians, right? But okay, within Israel, within Jewish Israel.
Right.
Jerusalem Day is a little more complicated, and it's really only celebrated by the national religious. And that year, wow, what a celebration. And I stayed up till 2, or I think it was 2 a.m. to wait for Merkaz Harav, a very religious Zionist yeshiva, like really very strongly religious Zionist, Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi, and his son, very reflective of their ideology. And they danced down to the Western Wall in the middle of the night, the whole yeshiva, right? Hundreds and hundreds of boys, which for an 18-year-old girl is already a reason to stay up until 2 in the morning, right? All these cute boys with their white shirts and blue pants. And so I waited up and I danced down with them, and it's unbelievable, right? You're at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, and you're going through the empty streets of Jerusalem, and you're singing and the flags and so on. Such nationalism. And we get to the old city, and instead of making a right to go through the Jewish quarter, they go straight down through the Arab market, which again, at that point, I didn't really do that so much by myself. The first Intifada broke out that year, by the way, it was 1987. And so 87, 88. And so already I wasn't going through, but here we are, dancing in the flags and really this sense, and I'm going to use a strong word, of sovereignty. And so you felt like you were sovereign, like this is your land. This is, you can be anywhere, meaning we deserve this. We've worked for this. We've suffered for this. This is our victory. You dance through the Arab quarter and get to the Western Wall and up all night and so on and so on. And then I went back to America. I went back for college. I went to Stern College in New York City. And I joined the Zionist group on campus, meaning everyone knew I was making Aliyah as soon as I finished college, which I did. And then I came back when I was 19 to dance again, Jerusalem Day. I made it back in time, same time, 1 year later. All I could think about was that night and how powerful and impactful it was. And I waited up till 2 in the morning and we danced down. And as we get to the Arab quarter, I start looking around. Again, it's that moment where a crack appears. And I started thinking about all the people sleeping. I suddenly realized, wait, it's the middle of the night, 2, 3 in the morning. There are people here, there are shutters drawn, there are houses above the closed shops. What must they be thinking? This noise, this revelry, the flags, and it's not their celebration. And we're in the Arab market. And I felt uncomfortable. I remember that sense of acute discomfort, not sovereignty, not like, oh my God, I'm a little scared, but we're doing this and wow, hey, sing and dance. I felt acutely uncomfortable. And there was something very sobering about that recognition. And I look around and no one else is feeling that. We make it down to the Western Wall. And I never did that again. I realized that was already something that had become dissonant for me, that this awareness of people behind the closed shutters listening, having to listen to us, be disruptive in this way, in a way that was probably painful for them. And that was when I was 19. And I feel like that was a moment. I mean, there are going to be other moments. It takes a long time until a narrative begins to change. But I can definitely go back to that moment and say that was the beginning.
And then you were telling me about Irving Moskowitz, and he was buying.
Yeah. So when I did make Aliyah, what I had told you is I made Aliyah about 2 years later. I was 21. I came to Israel, and a rabbi who had been my rabbi in seminary, I was very close with him and his 9 children. And they really took me in, meaning any Shabbat that I had an aunt and I had this rabbi, meaning that was my family in Israel. And I'm very grateful to this day to both of them for really making that transition to living on my own in a strange land. As much as it was my land, it wasn't, right? Not yet. It took a long time. And they were very, I would say, very, very right wing. And some of their older kids were very involved in settling in Silwan or in parts of East Jerusalem where people who had money were buying buildings. And then, Israeli, particularly kids, would go and settle in those buildings and make a claim, and the army would have to come and protect them, however that was happening. And I wasn't comfortable with that. I remember, as much as I was really drawn to this passionate ideology of the land is ours, that was too much for me. Like I didn't want to do that. And it wasn't only because of the danger, that wasn't it at all. It was a discomfort of going into places that there was, again, a sense of taking something from within a space that felt dissonant, like that I didn't want to be part of that. And so again, that was another crack, meaning I was very involved with them outside of that work, right? I was very much hanging out with them and with their friends and going to all sorts of things, but I wasn't doing that. That was also something I wasn't doing. And so, once I got married, I really did leave that world of what I would call a more extreme settler ideology behind, even though, as you said when you introduced me, people look at me as a settler because I live in Gush Etzion. there are settlers and there are settlers, and that kind of ideology of all of the land is ours, that all, we kind of have to do whatever is necessary, and within rabbinate, they're not the extreme right-wing fanatics who are in Jerusalem right now causing that. They weren't that extreme. I really don't think I could have been part of that kind of rhetoric at all, but they were more extreme than I was comfortable with. And so I, kind of parted ways after I got married, with any of that.
Do you think that there's any differentiation by the Palestinians when they look at what you consider one type of settler from another type of settler?
Probably not. Meaning, when you're within something, you do recognize, and I'm sure within their communities also, there's an awareness of the nuance. But probably, we tend to flatten out people that we don't know and put them into baskets, right? Religious settler,
Right.
Palestinian extremist, right? That's what we do to people. And it's not an accurate reflection of the nuance and complexity that many people bring to their belief and to their ideology and so on. So it is true that I'm sure they might look at me as it doesn't really matter if I'm living in Hebron or if I'm living in Gush Etzion or if I'm living on a hilltop in Samaria. But I can tell you from within, there are significant differences in the way people vote, in the way people speak, in the way people act, and what they're going to do within that spectrum that we call religious Zionist. Religious Zionist settler.
When someone calls you a settler, what do you think? I mean, is that uncomfortable?
Yeah, it is. There are two anecdotes that I think I shared one. I don't know if I shared the other, but I was working in Tel Aviv. For many years, before I became a teacher and a lecturer, a writer, I was a writer. I wrote about biotech in Israel. I became like a biotech reporter for a magazine called Link, which two magazines, Link and Israel High Tech Investor. And at a certain point, one of my bosses rented space in Tel Aviv, and I was going to Tel Aviv, and he brought. There were some people there who I hadn't worked with in the past. And I remember someone turning and making a comment like, "Oh, you're a right-wing settler. You're one of those, like a right-wing settler." And I'm like, "Wait, who? What? What are you talking about? Right-wing settler? What are you talking about?" Like, I didn't see myself that way, and I didn't understand that others saw me that way. And again, that's a moment where you begin to realize, wait a minute, I need to find out what that means and why people see me that way. And am I that way? Am I that because I look that, or I live in a place that is that? And the other anecdote was really a beloved student of mine at the time who had spent, I teach in a place called Pardes, the Pardes Institute. Wonderful, wonderful, open, non-judgmental, non-denominational Beit Midrash. I encourage anyone. The Torah belongs to everyone. We invite Jews from all over, whatever their background, whatever their denomination, to come and study. The text should be yours. You should, we believe that strongly. And we do get a lot of left-wing, particularly, left-wing liberal American Jews from different, rabbinical students and from all over. And we had a student, beloved student, who used to come over, and she would play with my kids, and she would do gymnastics with them. I had young children at the time. And at a certain point, after about a year, she had come, I think, 3 times for Shabbat. It wasn't a small amount. Like, we felt very close with her. I remember the year started. I went over to her and I said, "When are you coming for Shabbos?" And she paused, and she looked at me. She said, "Well, I don't cross the green line anymore." I'm like, it was almost like a punch to the gut. Like, what, green line? What are you talking about? I live across I knew intellectually I lived across the green line, but I honestly did not understand until that moment that was going to get in the way of a relationship. Like, okay, so what? You've come 3 times. We're close to you. And I was angry. I was angry because I was angry that she was essentially giving up the relationship, because I understood there was no way really, for us to continue that degree of closeness, that you can have when you sit around someone's table and they feed you and you spend a Shabbat together and so on. And she wasn't in a position to invite me and my family. She was a single woman, right? So that really meant the end of something. And that I was angry and then I was sad. But what it spurred me to do, and I don't remember how much after it did, was to begin to try to understand more the narrative of students like her. Like, what were they seeing? What were they understanding? Why had she taken that position? And so, kind of, I guess the next stage was there are a lot of things that are happening. Obviously, nothing is linear, but I went on a Breaking the Silence tour. And I remember being very, very nervous about it. But I also felt determined to do it because I really wanted to understand more clearly what these other narratives were that were conflicting with mine, or that were causing people to think badly of me for my narrative. And again, that was another major moment where I opened myself. I remember being very nervous because I thought, it's very hard to do something where someone is going to try to erase your identity or challenge your identity. I was very nervous about it. It turned out I got very lucky. I was told later that I ended up having one of the founders of Breaking the Silence, but while he was actually quite extreme, when he did his tour, he was very balanced. And so he really was giving both narratives simultaneously. And it allowed me to listen. As an educator, I often think, it's one of the things I think about the most, how do we get students to listen to what we want to teach? How do we present material so it's most available for people to interact and engage with? And what he did was very, very smart, because he validated both sides. And that meant that whatever side you were on when you walked into the tour, you heard yourself being represented fairly, and then you were challenged to hear another narrative, and I could listen. And I've thought a lot about that. In terms of, I do a lot of work with religious LGBTQ, again, Jewish religious LGBTQ members of the community, and trying to get people who are very afraid of that to be compassionate or to listen, or to, you often have to hold their narrative first before you can begin opening another narrative. And the same thing with the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. And it's the same thing I tell the vegans. My daughter's a vegan. You can't show people slaughterhouse videos. You have to first acknowledge that, okay, I understand you're going to keep eating meat, and I want you to think about how maybe you can reduce some of your consumption, and so on. It often, I think, is more effective, and more people can make movement if you allow two narratives. Anyway, I'll pause there, Penny. You can take it from where you.
Well, it's so much of, I think, the interactions that I see in peace work and everything about bringing two groups together. It seems the teachers who are really effective are the ones who can put aside their own narrative and try at least to see where they're coming from. And I just see it time and time again. I did want to go back, because it's such an important part of your life, is why did you make Aliyah to Israel?
Yeah, I made Aliyah because, I think it was two things. As I said, the religious Zionism and the narrative, and the recognition that there was something wondrous and historical about being able to return to this country, to this land, after so many thousands of years of being displaced. The Holocaust, of course, is always in the background for anyone. My grandparents were all born in America. I just want to say I'm like third generation born in America. My great grandparents were the Ellis Island generation, so I didn't have Holocaust in my background. But there was a wondrousness and a miraculousness to the Jewish people ending up in Israel. That was definitely a big piece of that. And as I said, this sense of feeling at home when I came when I was in 6th grade, and then again at 18, it was hard to explain. I knew this is just where I needed to be, even though there was a lot of it got harder before it got easier. In other words, when I came to Israel at 21, when I moved to Israel, there was kind of a honeymoon stage after the first few months of adjustment. And then at a certain point, I was like, what was I doing? Right? Like I've picked up and I've moved, and yeah, it's nice to be here, but I miss my family. I miss the culture, the way schools operate, the way hospitals operate. Like there's so much that's different. But by then I was already, married with children, and we were here. So I came because of ideology, because of religious ideology. There's no question. And I stayed because I had committed to something. And in the same way I committed, to being observant, I chose to continue to be observant at a point where you grow up with it, but then you ultimately choose. It was bigger than myself. Meaning it was something bigger that I had committed to. And I felt that it would have to get pretty bad for me to renege on that commitment.
You described yourself, and that's I'm Jewish and I am not Orthodox, and so you can tell by my questioning that you're a rabbinate. Could you describe what that means?
Yes,
and
I'm a
and why you're that as opposed to a rabbi?
Yeah, so rabbinate is the correct, rabbinate is the rabbinate, right, where the rabbis serve.
Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, it's hard to know when you see it written how to pronounce it. Yeah, so a little bit, this is turning a little bit to the left, if that's okay, or to the right, whichever way. We're going to go a little off target, but I think ultimately everything connects to everything. In addition to being a religious Zionist, I'm also a feminist. And that was something that I think was part of my American upbringing, right? That idea, also the permission I was kind of given at home. My dad's an academic, and I was drawn to feminism and this idea of equality and women and men and gender and so on. And so, for an Orthodox Jew, there's a lot of what to think about and question. There's not equality. It is not an egalitarian system in any way. And I began studying Jewish text. And, people often ask me why I stayed in Orthodoxy. And I think for a very simple reason, it's familiar. It's something that I have deeply engaged with. I feel that there's meaning there. And I chose to struggle from within. And part of my struggling from within was to become more and more knowledgeable about the texts that have shaped and shaped not just my identity, but the identity of my community for thousands of years. And the privilege I felt at being able to access these texts, the Bible, of course, but the Talmud and the tomes of Jewish law, which women only really began studying seriously, I would say 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Really, I'm among the first generation, I would say a half a generation after perhaps my predecessors, who thank God many are still alive. But really this generation of Orthodox young women who were beginning to study Jewish texts that had formerly only been accessible to men. And I took that responsibility very seriously. And so I would say for 30 plus years, I have been studying and I've been teaching. And part of that process has been trying to think a lot about continuity and about tradition and about change, and recognizing that a lot has changed, and yet certain things have changed very slowly. And ordination for women is one of those things that I think, if I were 25 now or 23 now, perhaps I would think differently, but I'm not. I'm twice that, right? I'm 51. And I was shaped by the study halls, the Batei Midrash that shaped me. And I realized the title didn't really matter to me as much as the content. In other words, I had been given the content, access to content similar to what men learn when they study for ordination, but I didn't really feel the title. And I recognize that particularly younger women are going to disagree with me. And maybe I have colleagues who use the title rabbi, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Orthodox colleagues, female colleagues who use the title rabbi, and will say to me, but if you don't start using the title and kind of pushing for it, then how is change ever going to happen? So I recognize that what I've done is very nuanced. As you've probably gathered, I'm drawn to nuance and moderation as a way of affecting change longer term. But I also am grateful to those who want to push ahead more quickly because they make room for people like me. So, after many years of studying both Jewish text and Talmud, I belong to a group, you mentioned them, Beit Hillel, I think, which is about moderate rabbinic voices. that very consciously integrated women. And the question came up at some point, what are we going to call these women? We're not going to use rabbi, that's too political, it's too fast, it's too unconventional, but we do want to think of a title that will represent their years of study. So this was a serious question, and rabbinate has traditionally meant the rabbi's wife in Israel, like Rebbitzin in Yiddish. However, we repurposed it. In other words, the idea was to take a familiar term, a non-threatening term, and use it to represent something else, to represent the knowledge and skill. Like, again, it's not rabbi, Rav, right? It's rabbinate, but within that, you hear the tone or the echo of what it represents or what it potentially represents. And again, when people hear that, they're not threatened, rabbinate. And then many times they'll say, is your husband a rabbi? No. So what is that? Tell me what that is. And then when I explain, it's about 30 years of study, many years of studying Talmud and Jewish law. Oh, like that makes sense. Now suddenly they have acknowledged the body of knowledge that I have studied and I have gained fluency in, without being distracted by a title that might seem threatening. So again, I think it fits in very well with my approach in general to how I try to mindfully move through the things that I've done and the direction I've taken.
One thing that's always present in speaking of Israel and society, and it has so much complexity and layers, and you mentioned change over time, and we get to the fact that you have 4 daughters, and that 3 have been in the military, the Israeli military, and here, of course, in the US, it's much more unusual for a female to go into the services, and in Israel it's actually required. And I was wondering what you do with that how do you deal with that? How did you feel about that?
Yeah, so it's one of those moments. I talked about being an American in Israel, American immigrant. The honeymoon phase ended, and I spent a lot of years struggling with living here, particularly when I would go home. No, even though I'm saying go home to my parents' home, my childhood home, and which was my dad only sold a few years ago. My mom died 10 years ago. My dad sold that home, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And so I was always going home with first alone, and then with my husband, and then with my kids. And getting on the plane was brutal. I would come back, and really for the first week or 2, I would just be depressed. And it was hard for me to give myself permission, because I was living in the Jewish homeland. How could I be depressed? Like, what is wrong with me? And so then I would be angry. And at a certain point, I said to myself, it was after actually I finished a book about Indian immigrants coming to America. And it was a novel. I like to read books about different cultures. And I thought, oh, I'm an immigrant, meaning I've never allowed myself to think of myself that way, because I'm a Jew and I speak Hebrew and this is my land. And then I thought, but I'm an immigrant, because certain things, I was not born here. I was not raised here. I brought a whole set of identity, like my identity as an American, my familiarity with things, even certain products and certain ways of thinking and language and hair, music, jokes, right? All of that. By the time you're 21, it's very hard to pivot and start, kind of completely absorbing another culture, even if you're familiar with the extra, with a lot of the externals. And after that moment, I think I had been here 18 years when I finally said, oh, I'm an immigrant. And that's why I don't fully understand what's going on in my kids' school, which made me, by the way, a little less involved as a parent, because I don't know what's going on, right? Like and then the Army, so we'll talk about the Army, was yet another moment where I'm like, I don't really get this. There's no way for me to get this. My husband served in the Army. He too is an American, but he came at 15. So his transition, he finished high school here. He went to a yeshiva program here for Israeli young men, did the Army, went to the Technion, meaning like he acculturated much more, quickly than I did. He'll still say there are things that, he was 15, not 3, not 5. And there are still things which he's very much more American than Israeli, but he's more Israeli than American. at this point, I would say I'm more Israeli than American also. I've been here 30 years, but even so, there are things I still don't understand, and the Army is one of them. So, so when my daughters decided to draft, three have already finished the Army. It was both a terrifying moment, but also a moment of belonging. Like, oh, I'm finally belonging. I have a daughter doing the Army. That's enormous, right? That's an enormous sign of belonging. I have this young woman coming home wearing the uniform. I have this young woman coming home and I have to do her laundry before she gets, like, I'm doing all the things Israeli mothers do. I still wasn't doing them completely right? Like that. My husband will always say he remembers when he finished whatever course he finished and the parents come and the Israeli parents come with food, and his mother brought like cake and potato chips. Like, she had no idea that, like, there's like what you do when you go to these things. She had no idea. So I knew a little bit more. Look at my husband, right? He was definitely the bridge. He understood all the abbreviations. He was able to talk to them more fluently. And I did, the things moms do. And, I did the laundry and I did made the cookies and whatever. But I didn't fully get it. And I recognized I did, and they knew I did it. And that was okay. I mean, we all understood that mom was never going to get it. Like, I would be able to hold what they were going through as much as I could. But the proof was my daughter has still not forgiven me completely. She was really struggling. And I ended up, and of course, when your daughter struggles and it's very, very hard, I ended up calling up some like commanding officer who ended up getting her commanding officer into trouble. Like, it was a whole story. And she's like, you just don't get it. You don't do things like, okay, but I did, So, so I was very proud of my first daughter served in intelligence. My second daughter also served in intelligence. And then my third daughter served in combat, which was a whole new experience, right? So by the second, I was like, oh, this is familiar. I already know more or less what's going to happen. And then the third daughter decided to do something completely different, and we had to reorient.
What do you do? What do you do as a mom with your fear?
I would say what I do, I know, some mothers will say they don't sleep the entire time their kids are in the Army. I surprised myself by compartmentalizing and saying, I can't live with suffocating fear. I have to trust everything's going to be okay. And I'm just going to compartmentalize to the best of my ability because there's nothing I can do. It took me a while. In other words, whenever something wasn't going well for particularly the first one, I was trying to problem solve. What can I do? Who can we call? There must be something we can do. What do you mean we get? And then at a certain point, that letting go and realizing you can't problem solve this. Like, this is an entity both foreign to you and bigger than you, and there really is nothing at times you can do. And that letting go is a bit frightening. That sense of loss of control. But I did try to do that, like that sense of being aware. Okay, I'm going to have to assume everything's going to be okay.
Was the problem she was having had to do with being in the military or something very specific?
No, it had to do with, I think with her, it was very grating on her mental health. And it was part of being in the Army. She also had to let go of any semblance of control, which many young men and women really fight because we educate them towards autonomy, that clash between autonomy and authority, right? And when you go into the Army, you have to relinquish your autonomy. And I've seen this with other young men and women as well. It can really break you, that sense of loss of control over yourself, which to be a good soldier, you actually have to do. You have to submit to authority, right? Now, what happens if you're in moral dilemma? I'm not going to go into what the problem is there, but right. You do have to let go of your autonomy, because they're going to be telling you when you get up and when you go to sleep and what you're eating and in order for the Army to function, you have to do that. And it's it broke her until she was able to pick herself up. And I will say both my daughters went through something similar, the first two, but the Army made them. There's no question that when they got out of the Army, they were more mature, they were more responsible, they had gone through something significant that had kind of broken them and then rebuilt them. And I've heard that sometimes it breaks you and you can't rebuild, right? I don't want to glorify the army. I really, really don't. I'm talking about my own daughters and what I saw and how frightening it was to see the breaking down. But also they will acknowledge, as will I, that when they emerged, when they finished their service, they had, again, it's this recognition that my life is not only about me. There are other things that are bigger than me. And I often find the difference between my wonderful 18-year-old, I love my American students, don't get me wrong, but you really see the maturity difference in those ages between 18 and 22. I mean, there's no comparison that Israeli kids are more mature. And even my 16-year-old, knowing that the national service or army or whatever she does lies ahead, shifts you away from me. My life is all about me. It's about how I feel and so on. No, it's not, because when you're in a system like that, it's not about you. It's about what you're contributing. And sometimes it's not in your best interest. So I think, I learned a lot about hoping and praying and waiting and relinquishing control and so on. And then seeing the power of the transformation as they went very low and were able, to start moving upwards.
So were your kids raised as peace activists, acknowledging what was going on with the Palestinians, and now that they have to fight potentially or worse? Or was that a whole later revelation in your life cycle that you hadn't reached and they didn't have to combat in their own minds and philosophies of what they were doing and where they were headed when they were in the military?
Yeah, so look, part of my journey took place while the oldest, I would say probably around the time the oldest was going through the army, beginning to think and rethink and be aware of other narratives. I only became involved in Roots, which we'll talk about a little later, 7 years ago.
Yeah.
So that would have been, my second daughter would have been in the army when I began. But the Breaking the Silence tour was definitely when my first daughter was in the army. I mean, I was going through this and I was sharing it with them. And I will say my first three are they vote left and they're far more aware of both narratives, sensitive to both narratives, even as they're very proudly Israeli. They're not, they do believe in the army service they did. They understand why they needed to do it and so on. So I think what's interesting about my children is that they, again, have a lot of nuance. They were not raised that way by their school by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, their school, their youth groups, very largely very right-wing, their friends, and they began to be responsive, I think, to some of what I was bringing home, some of the students I was bringing home from Pardes, thoughtful, they're very thoughtful young adults. And so, they are not threatened by the idea of two narratives and trying to be aware of what's going on in their country and how we need to maybe think in different directions for the future. And my youngest daughter is still very much, she's 16 and she's in B'nai Akiva, and she's 16, but I'm not going to say it's because she's 16. She's far more right-wing than they were even at that age. And, that's her right. I just want her to be exposed to different thought processes. I want her to be aware of different kinds of people and the goodness of different kinds of people. I don't want her to stereotype or pigeonhole. But she's certainly allowed to, as she grows up and begins to vote and become a member of society, I'm certainly not going to be disappointed if she chooses differently than I do, as long as, again, there's no discrimination and racism, as long as the racism, discrimination, extremism, I don't think she will, but she, I think, ideologically will be different than me. And I've raised my children to make choices, and, I can't control what that is.
This has been extremely interesting, but let's get to Roots.
Yeah.
Can you describe what Roots Shorashim Judah is?
Yeah, so I'll take you back 7 years because I'd like to talk a little bit about what it is for me. 7 years ago, the school that I teach at, it should tell you again that it's an unusual seminary because on one hand, very much religious Zionist, B'nai Akiva, and so on. On the other hand, they also want to expose their students to different voices in not just in the conflict, but in in religion and across the religious spectrum, and here too in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Also because these kids are going back to American universities where there's often a very strong anti-Israel lobby, and trying to give them a more complete picture so they're prepared to articulate answers, right? Because for their own good, that having control over information is often, or having the more information you have, knowledge is power, of course. So they brought roots. I remember this because I hosted them in my home. It was at a time where Aliyah Abu Awad, one of the major Palestinians involved in Roots, couldn't get a permit to come into Jerusalem, and I live in Gush Etzion. Roots is in Gush Etzion. So the head of my program said, could you host so that the students can hear Shaul Yudomin and Ali speak, Shaul being the Jewish activist. And what was amazing about that evening was, like the Breaking the Silence tour, it didn't eradicate either narrative. In other words, it didn't force me to choose sides. It didn't force me to feel bad about my narrative. It forced me, or allowed me, is a better word. It allowed me to be open to Ali's story without feeling threatened by it. It's amazing when someone can do that, right? When you can not be threatened by the narrative that really, to some degree, is the polar opposite of your own, right? Or is the narrative that you think most threatens you. And so in the course of that evening, I remember what they were offering, they were trying to inspire, was not this big picture of like, what do we have to do, in order to change the conflict, but what can we as human beings living in this area of Gush Etzion, begin to do to try to change the way we look at one another, and seeing that as essential to any sort of real progress. And I thought, I can do that. That's what I said. Then I'm like, I can do what they're asking me to do. They're not asking me to apologize for my narrative. They're not asking me to write away my narrative, to erase it. They're asking me to begin to listen to another narrative so I don't dehumanize or pigeonhole or stereotype Palestinians, but start giving them names and faces and excuse me one moment, and people with stories and families and so on. And I remember it was Aliyah or Shaul saying it's a drop in the bucket, but one drop after another. And I thought that's what a grassroots movement is. It's not getting not despairing over, we're never going to get out of this, it's never going to change, and so on. And this was happening more or less at the same time that things had really escalated in Gush Etzion. There were some terrible tragedies which affected people that I personally am close with, some terror incidents, murders, and so on. And I thought, I want to do something. I don't want to just feel helpless. I don't want to fall into the victim mentality. I don't want to be only the ones with the guns. Like that, enough. Like there's got to be some other way. And I felt like they opened up for me the possibility of doing something different. And so Roots du jour is about bringing people dafka in Gush Etzion, in the settlements, right? Israeli settlers together with Palestinians into a space where they begin the very human journey of talking to one another, of sharing stories. There are all sorts of photography courses for women, teenagers who get together and go hiking. And one time I went and cleaned up garbage nearby, like things that we can just all agree on, that we are, part of this human race and this human condition, and we can not put aside our differences. We don't do that. And at times we speak about our differences, but it's a very, it's a place filled with humanity and filled with the recognition that God's image is found in all of us. And so let us try to pull together rather than pull apart.
Reminds me of my own journey with them. The first roots activists I ever spoke to were Aliyah and Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger when they were on a tour here. And it was just after our trip, which was during 2014, during Operation Protective Edge. And it's what I talked about in my beginning clip, that, you know, there's nothing like fearing for your own life and the life of your family to really adjust the way you look at the world. And when we came back home, and like I said, they were just a few months after we came back home, they spoke, and it changed. I mean, the trip changed me. I had decided I started working on my book about what happened and wanting to work on peace, and then meeting them. The one thing that I would say about everyone that I've met from Roots is that everyone there over time certainly can speak very well of the other's narrative, yet still maintain their own, which has been adjusted with the knowledge, you know, that they've learned. But the respect is very apparent, and the understanding is very apparent. And it doesn't mean, because I've talked to so many roots activists, and you hear where the narrative has changed, and you hear where the narrative hasn't changed, and it's just really so respectful of people that it's really beyond the politics. It's a life lesson on being a human, and how to show respect to one another, even when you disagree. Up to that point, had you had many interactions with Palestinians, even though you live right there? All of the conversations I seem to have with the peace activists is that they were living right there, but really hadn't talked to a Palestinian.
Right. Well, you know, Palestinians built my home. In other words, we hired, we did three renovations in the course of living here in 25 years. And each time we hired the same family, different brother, the whole family of brothers. So each time a different brother was at that point in charge of the contracting. And we got along great with them. And I always found them to be respectful and hardworking, and they did a great job. And, but I never met their families. I never went to their homes, you know, so it was very, very limited. It was very positive. I mean, to this day, when we see them, they pull over, they say hello, how's the family, and so on. But it was very, very limited. So it's not that I knew no Palestinians, but the Palestinians I knew, we hired to work for us. Other than that, you know, the people we saw in the supermarkets, but no formal interaction. Maybe again, I sometimes talk to the workers in the Rami Levy supermarket. Some of the familiar ones, the ones you see all the time, and hello, and what's your name, and so on. But other than that, no real interaction, no.
What's the attitude of most of the settler of your neighbors toward the fact that you work with Palestinians?
Yeah, you know, I think my friends, on one hand, they're all Americans. Many of my friends are Americans. None of them have come to events, which is sad to me. Tonight, I actually saw someone from my community, not a friend of mine, but a member of the community who was there, which was nice. Yeah, they're not interested. They're not interested. They're not against it. They listen, but they're not really interested. I will say there are some teenagers from this community who go to the teen group and are active there, meaning there are little pockets. But it is a little disappointing that more people aren't interested. And yet, Hanan will tell you, Shil will tell you, they do get hundreds of people from the Gush coming to events, different groups, and so on and so forth. They have had an impact. It certainly doesn't cause people to like yell at me or protest my going to Roots. They have established a place in the community, and I think people are happy it's there. But the question is, how can you get people to recognize the potential in this initiative? So I talk a lot about it. I talk a lot about it with my friends. I share the stories. I speak about it when I study. And I think that at least, plant seeds. Remember, we talked to how long does it take for a narrative to change? How long does it take for a crack to appear? Maybe I'm the one planting the cracks right now. And in 20 years, they'll be more prepared. I have to recognize that things really take time.
You're in a dialogue group that happens to have a lot of the Palestinians that are in there, they're Christian. Is that a different experience? Do they talk much about what it's like to be a Palestinian Christian?
Yeah, so we're actually a very small group, but the Palestinian Christians have talked about how much of a minority they are and the discrimination they face as being Christian among their Muslim neighbors, right? And then Palestinians, or the Israeli Palestinians. So they really have two, points of conflict, if you will, the Christian and the Palestinian. Sami Awad, who was the director, I think it was called the Holy Land Trust. Now I think he's the educational director. I remember at one point he said that the impact of this group meeting, and it's particularly religious leaders, right? Everyone is a leader in some capacity, educational, religious, and so on, was that when people begin to, kind of not put down, but like criticize in his, Israelis, he's able to say to them, hey, I know other Israelis, they're not all like that. And I thought, wow, that's such an important change, right? We talked earlier, we stereotype, we pigeonhole. Does anyone look at me differently because I live in Gush Etzion and not on a hilltop in Samaria, or not in Hebron, I didn't take over an abandoned house and just illegally settle? No, because I am pigeonholed as a settler. It doesn't matter that I might be a different kind of, have different ideology and different thoughts. And I think that that moment where Sami was able to say, no, I tell them I know other kinds of Israelis. There are other Israelis. They speak differently. They think differently. That's a successful moment. And I would say I've had a similar evolution in terms of sitting with Christians who, again, I certainly never sat with Christians and broke bread and spoke about theology, and the awareness that, with goodwill, we can begin learning each other's texts, even difficult texts. We can begin talking about theology. We can realize that religion has the opportunity to really, I won't even call it religion, manipulation of religion certainly can lead to violence, and yet religion has so much commonality to it if we're all searching for a relationship with God. And so yeah, that's been unusual, and I've been in it, I think, already for like 4 years, and we've managed to keep it up. And there are some very special people in the group, priests and Palestinians and Jews, Orthodox Jews, and I think we really have a wonderful dynamic. And I think we're all using it in our spaces. Wherever we go back, we take the texts or the conversations with us, and I think that's impactful.
So you're part of that group. You also speak with Noor Wad, who was my second interview. Do you belong to any other Roots groups, or what are your other activities, if any, with Roots?
Yeah, so I would say this year, well, with Corona, really, obviously, everything's been scaled back. But I will say in the past, I took part in 2 groups that were significant. One was a women's group. What was interesting there is it was Israeli and Palestinian women, and we needed a translator. a blind Muslim woman, an academic, Laila Abedo, that's how you pronounce it, who I would pick up and bring out to Gush Etzion, and she was able to translate Arabic into Hebrew and back, and so that slows things down, having a translator, but we made it work. The atmosphere in the room was just wonderful, like just full of laughter and curiosity and giggling, and an attempt to try to find, pointing out one another's clothing or boots or whatever, like the things we often like to notice, hairstyles and so on. And then learning, we tried, we did not just try, learning one another's texts, like a piece from the Quran about Abraham and a piece from the Torah. It was interesting to see again that the Israeli women, Jewish women, are very adept at learning text and kind of devour text and love new text and so on. And the Muslims didn't really know, the Palestinian women didn't really know what to do with that, right? Like that idea of how do you do critical text study. But largely it was the conversations about family. We focused on family, what it's like to be a daughter, what it's like to be a mother, what it's like to be a sister, names of our children, how we chose names for our children, what it's like to be a wife. And that really fueled a lot of points of connection throughout the year. And at the very end of the year, all year there's this tension of not being able to eat together, which was like they would bring in food. Why can't you have some cookies, whatever? And, all the women there were Orthodox and kept kosher and so on. And at the end of the year, the Roots decided we would have a meal together, and they made the kitchen kosher. At Roots, there is a kitchen used by the Abu Awad family who lived there, and so they made the kitchen kosher, and then we prepared a meal together, which was wonderful. It was actually, unfortunately, a time where violence had broken out on the Temple Mount like that day. So again, very real, very part of the encounters, and I remember the Palestinian women were making grape leaves, which were, they did very well, stuffed grape leaves. And I was trying to copy them, and I was just hopeless at it. And they, quick, chopping, filling and so on. And I brought a few of them home afterwards because my youngest daughter is a cook. She taught herself to cook on YouTube videos, and she's quite gourmet. And at the time she was young, she was 10, 11. And I brought home the grape leaves, and I said, here, I brought you these grape leaves. You've got to taste these. Like, they're so much better than anything you've ever had. And she's like, no, I don't want to eat them. I hate them. I hate those women. And I thought, oh my God, it's that moment as a mother where you feel like, how do I raise this child? I'm like, what's wrong with you? Do you explode at your 10-year-old child? Are you a racist? So I actually give myself a little credit. I'm not always this, but I stopped myself from yelling at her. And I said to her, why do you hate them? And she turned to me and she said, because I'm afraid of them. Because Palestinians killed my friend's grandfather. I'm scared of them. And I thought, wow, I almost missed that, right? And that, the ability of a 10-year-old to not have artifice and say, well, I hate them because I'm afraid of them. That's so there, right? That's so prevalent, that fear that often turns to hate, because that loss of control I feel when I'm afraid. So it's easier to hate than to face the loss of control. And so, since then we've talked a lot about that. And, she still has not come with me. I'm hoping one day, she's now 16. She'll come with me to Roots. She knows I go, and she now jokes about it. And we've had many conversations. And she knows I vote differently than she will ever vote. We're not in the same place, but I think she'll, I think we're getting there, where the time, how long does it take for the narrative to change, even in a home like mine, right? How influenced are you by what all your friends do? You don't want to look different. I certainly know that, being the only Jewish kid, being the only religious kid, how you don't want to stick out as being different, being other. In your teens, you really don't. So that idea that I might go to something my friends would never go to, I'm not comfortable with that. My religious Zionist youth movement, my school, all of that are talking differently than my mom. I hear my mom, I'm not as afraid anymore, I'm not as threatened, but I'm not ready. And making sure the child is always invited, right? I invite her, and she can decide whether to come or not. And that's the only way I think that, again, we can hope to move forward there. So that was the women's group. And there was one more group I was part of, and I'll just talk about that for a moment because it really speaks to the complexity of these encounters. It was a mixed group of men and women. It was mostly Palestinian men and Israeli women. Again, very interesting. Young Palestinian men and women more my age, not all. There were some, obviously older men and younger women. There were almost no Palestinians. There was like one in the group who didn't stay. She was like, I'm not going to be the token woman. And there were a few men, a few Israeli men, a few. And it was far more aggressive in a way. It was interesting, right? I talked about the women that was very warm and talking about children and about clothing and about hair, like it was not political almost at all. And this was much more political in the sense that very quickly getting to topics about soldiers and occupation and terrorism, very, very powerful. And the moderators were using music and musical instruments as a way of like doing some very interesting exercises. And in the course of like two terrible tragedies happened, meaning in one case, and this happened first, a young Palestinian man was shot. An unarmed young Palestinian man who had stopped by the side of the road to help someone was shot by a soldier, and terrible, right? Shot and killed. And it was the close friend of someone in the group. And so we had to hold that, right? That tragedy. And a week or two later, Ari Fold, whose brother is married to one of my best friends, was stabbed by a 16-year-old terrorist at the Gush Etzion Junction. And everyone knew him, and he was from Efrat. And so you ended up having these two enormous tragedies that, again, I'm not going to go into the politics. In fact, one was terror and one was, say negligence, right, and so on. It doesn't really matter. The background doesn't matter. What mattered is that people in the group had lost friends to this, and how do you hold that? And I think the group actually did a very good job of making space for the mourning, for the grief, for the fact that one side had essentially caused this to the other side, right? That awareness, and that was very special. And I think Roots does deal with a lot of that. Like it's there, it's very present. And I know the critique is, well, so what are you doing with this, and how is this changing anything? I can't speak to, that's what I said earlier. I can't worry right now about the bigger picture. I'm doing too many things. I can't solve the conflict, right? I can only do my tikkun olam, one drop at a time. I can only try to be a better person, more of a mensch, more aware and thoughtful and sensitive, and try to change the rhetoric and try to change the way I perceive the situation. That's all I can do. And I think that's something, and it's never going to be, it's never enough. There's always more, and hopefully we're always moving forward.
Did you handle what was going on just in the group? Or I know Roots, when incidents happen, often go to the families. Yeah. And
so I think in both cases, they definitely sent condolences and sent some sort of, offered, I think, to come. I don't think in either case they always ask the families what the families want. That's very important. And I don't think in either case they were able to come as a mixed group, but they certainly do things like that. And they certainly get involved when in Gush Etzion, if Palestinian land is being trespassed on, they'll get involved and try to help ease that situation with the municipality, meaning they definitely have a lot of feelers on the ground and are a resource for both Israelis and Palestinians.
So as the last question to you, if you were speaking to the people of the world, what would the message be that you'd want them to know about your work on peace and your community?
I think what I want people to know, or people who are listening to perhaps take with them, is exactly what I've been reflecting on, and in myself I work on, is you don't have to erase one narrative for another. In other words, I've said that to American groups who come, that part of what concerns me about the pro-Palestinian narrative on college campuses is that it's a very inflexible, rigid narrative, very, very, in which there's no room for Israel. And I don't see how that can be productive in any way. And that's not going to succeed in creating any sort of more liability, responsibility, awareness. And I'd like people, that's what I'd like people to take with them. Open yourselves up to more nuance, to being able to listen to other narratives, wherever you are, whether it be in this conflict, in your own lives. Everyone has, something that they feel threatened by or they push back at. And sometimes instead of pushing back, letting go and say, you know what, I can hold on to this piece of myself and still listen to a piece of someone else. And that will help me bridge or see the humaneness, the Tselem Elohim, the divine image in the other person by not trying to do this, not trying to, make one thing fit into, on top of another and so on. Like things can be like this. They don't have to be like this and they don't have to be like this. And I'd like to encourage everyone to take a little bit of that with them.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Nechama, for sharing your knowledge with us and for working so hard on peace. Next week on Peace with Penny, we'll be doing something different and having a two-part interview with two members of the organization Combatants for Peace. First, I'll be interviewing Eli Avador, an Israeli peace activist, November 2nd at 11 a.m. Pacific time for part one. And the following week on Tuesday, November 9th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, I'll be interviewing Ahmed Hilu, a Palestinian peace activist, for part two. These are two compelling stories of peacemaking and transformation, and we wanted to have enough time for both. Eli Avador fought as a soldier in the Israeli army in the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and was wounded and spent 3 months in the hospital. Yet today he is against what many call the occupation, and he spends his time working with Combatants for Peace. We're sure you'll find his story fascinating and a lesson in introspection and change. We hope you'll join us. To our listeners today and those listening to the recording later, thank you, and may you live in peace, shalom, and salam.